Carl Jung's final message about empaths will shatter everything you thought you knew about compassion. What if the sensitivity you've always carried, that almost overwhelming pull to care for others, wasn't a spiritual gift at all, but a survival strategy? Jung proposed that what we now call the empath isn't born from light, but from necessity. The empath is the child who was never allowed to be selfish. Instead of learning that their feelings were valid, they were taught, sometimes subtly, sometimes brutally, that their needs were too much, their emotions too loud, and their existence conditional on serving others. This survival programming follows them into adulthood. The urge to heal, to fix, to absorb everyone else's pain is not just kindness. It is adaptive wiring, born from a nervous system that learned long ago. If I keep everyone else stable, maybe I will finally feel safe. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. He didn't see empaths as broken. He saw them as unfinished. Halfway along the great psychological journey he called individuation, the process of becoming whole. In other words, the empath's suffering isn't evidence of weakness. It's evidence of potential transformation. You've probably felt this truth within yourself. That nagging suspicion that your empathy came with a cost. That while others praised your compassion, a part of you was quietly exhausted by it. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, the tragedy is that who they truly are has often been buried beneath years of self-abandonment. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your sensitivity feels like both a blessing and a burden. More importantly, you'll see how Jung's teachings point towards something I call sacred selfishness, a healthy, necessary form of self-love and boundary setting. This is not about becoming less caring. It is about reclaiming the right to care for yourself as fiercely as you've always cared for others. Childhood hypervigilance, the empath's first training ground. Jung understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. What we call empathy in adults often begins as emotional hypervigilance in childhood. Imagine a small child who learns to monitor their parents' moods before a word is spoken. That child becomes the family's emotional barometer, alert to every storm before it hits. To that child, their own needs bring conflict. But anticipating others' needs, that brings safety. Jung described this as premature ego adaptation, a sophisticated survival skill, but one born from necessity rather than healthy development. Neuroscience now backs this up. Research shows that children raised in emotionally unpredictable environments often develop heightened mirror neuron activity and stress response systems. Their brains literally wire themselves to detect subtle cues in facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language, because missing those cues could mean danger. This hyperattunement may look like empathy, but at its core it's vigilance. The empath's nervous system becomes like a seismograph, tuned to every tremor in the emotional atmosphere. Over time, this ability can feel like a gift, but it was forged in the fire of survival. The cost of suppressed selfishness. Here lies the paradox. In developing such extraordinary sensitivity, the child sacrifices something essential, what Jung called authentic selfishness, the natural ability every human needs to assert themselves, to claim space, to say, "I matter too." Jung once wrote, "The healthy individual is able to love himself as much as he loves others." But the future empath was trained in the opposite lesson. Love others more than yourself, because your needs are dangerous. Think about it. If you learned to read the room before you could even read books, you may recognize this story. You became the emotional detective in your family. You knew everyone's feelings, but never your own. And while this saved you then, it cost you now. This is the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you so attuned to others becomes the barrier that prevents you from truly knowing yourself. You became an expert on everyone else's inner world while remaining a stranger to your own. Jung understood that this survival pattern, while brilliant in childhood, becomes destructive in adulthood. The child who was never allowed to be selfish grows into the adult who cannot set boundaries, cannot advocate for themselves, and often cannot even identify what they need. In the next section, we'll go deeper into what Jung found hidden in the unconscious of empaths, their shadow self, and why it holds the key to healing. Far from being a place of darkness, Jung discovered that the shadow of the empath contains the very qualities they were always denied: anger, boundaries, self-respect, and the right to say no. Because the truth is this: your empathy was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a power. Meeting the shadow. When Carl Jung looked into the unconscious patterns of those we now call empaths, he found something startling. Beneath the kindness, beneath the endless giving, beneath the outward gentleness, there was a buried fire. What most empaths repress is not darkness in the way we usually think of it. It is not cruelty, not malice, not some monstrous secret. Instead, it is what Jung called forbidden selfishness, the basic right to want things, to set limits, to say no, to put the self first. From childhood, many empaths were conditioned to see these impulses as dangerous. Perhaps they were told directly, "Don't be selfish." Or perhaps they learned more subtly. Every time they cried, every time they needed attention, every time they expressed anger, love was withdrawn. Over time, these natural instincts were banished into the unconscious. Jung described this process as shadow formation through moral conditioning. In simple terms, society and families teach us what is good and what is bad. But often, what gets labeled bad isn't actually harmful. For the empath, what gets buried is the right to have boundaries. The empathic paradox. This leads to what I call the empathic paradox. The very trait that makes you so valued, your sensitivity, is the same trait that keeps you from valuing yourself. You became the listener, the fixer, the comforter. You learned how to tune so closely into other people's emotions that you could predict storms before they arrived. And while this made you indispensable to others, it also erased you from yourself. Jung recognized that this lopsided development leads to adulthood struggles, difficulty saying no without guilt, relationships built on giving rather than equality, chronic exhaustion from absorbing pain that isn't yours, a quiet, unspoken resentment at always being the strong one for everyone else. This is why Jung saw empaths not as saints, but as wounded healers. People who give not from fullness, but from emptiness. Who care compulsively because they fear what will happen if they don't. And beneath it all, Jung saw something even more radical. Empaths often carry a secret anger, not because they are unkind, but because the psyche has been forced into one-sidedness. Jung called this the compensation principle. The psyche always tries to balance what has been denied. So the empath who endlessly gives eventually begins to resent giving. The one who never says no eventually explodes. The one who suppresses their needs becomes bitter. This is the empath's crisis, the recognition that what once kept them safe is now destroying them. Sacred selfishness, the missing piece. Here is where Jung's insight becomes liberating. He argued that the selfish impulses buried in the empath's shadow are not pathological. They are not defects to be shamed. They are the missing pieces of a complete personality. Jung insisted that healthy development requires what he called healthy narcissism, the ability to love oneself as much as others. Without it, compassion becomes compulsive, a way of controlling the environment rather than a true gift. That's why I call this buried energy sacred selfishness. It is the right to exist fully, the right to rest, the right to take up space, the right to ask for reciprocity, the right to say, "My needs matter too." And here is the paradox. When empaths reclaim their sacred selfishness, they don't become less caring. They become more authentic. They can finally give without strings, without resentment, without exhaustion, because they are no longer abandoning themselves. Empathic burnout, the psyche's rebellion. For many empaths, this turning point arrives as what Jung described as the individuation imperative, a psychological crisis in which the false self built for survival collapses. Modern psychology calls it burnout. But for empaths, it's more than fatigue. It's a soul-level exhaustion. Suddenly, problems that once felt meaningful now feel unbearable. The desire to help feels heavy instead of natural. Even the smallest demands from others trigger resentment. Jung understood this not as failure, but as emergence. The psyche itself is rebelling against continued self-abandonment. Your authentic self, long buried, is demanding recognition. He described this process using his famous concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to unite opposites. For empaths, this means learning to balance the caring self with the self-caring self, not choosing one over the other, but holding both in integration. This stage feels dangerous because others often resist it. Friends, partners, even family may accuse you of changing, of becoming selfish. But Jung pointed out something profound. The people who truly love you will adapt to your growth. The people who resist, they were benefiting from your self-abandonment. He called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that being authentic will cost you connection. And sometimes it does. But as Jung reminded us, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. From compulsion to conscious choice. The empath who embraces sacred selfishness does not abandon their gift. They refine it. Empathy becomes a choice instead of a compulsion. You can feel with others without absorbing their pain. You can support without taking responsibility. You can love without disappearing. Jung called this differentiated love, the ability to relate as equals, not as caretaker and dependent. It is compassion rooted in strength rather than weakness. And perhaps most importantly, it is sustainable. The empath no longer gives from depletion, but from overflow. Reclaiming relationships. When Jung spoke of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, he knew it could not happen in isolation. Human beings are born in relationship, shaped in relationship, and transformed through relationship. For empaths, this truth is magnified. Their sensitivity makes relationships not just important, but central to their entire psychic landscape. Yet, when empathy is distorted into self-abandonment, relationships often become cages. They are built on unconscious contracts. I will keep you comfortable, and in return, you will not leave me. These contracts may feel safe, but they are not authentic. The collapse of false harmony. The first step in transformation is often the collapse of what looked like harmony. When an empath begins setting boundaries, the fragile balance maintained for years breaks. Friends who were used to endless listening suddenly feel slighted. Family members accustomed to sacrifice now feel neglected. Partners who relied on the empath's self-erasure may lash out or withdraw. Jung would see this not as failure, but as the psyche correcting imbalance. He argued that every relationship contains a psychological contract, spoken or unspoken, that maintains equilibrium. When one person changes, the contract dissolves. This dissolution can feel devastating. Many empaths retreat at this stage, believing they were wrong to assert themselves. But Jung urged perseverance. The breaking of false bonds is the prerequisite for authentic ones. The emergence of mutuality. Once the old contracts collapse, something new can be born: mutuality. Instead of giving to avoid abandonment, the empath learns to give freely, from choice rather than fear. Instead of listening compulsively, they listen attentively but also expect to be heard. This shift is subtle but revolutionary. Jung described it as moving from participation mystique, a blurred, fused connection where boundaries vanish, toward differentiated relationship, where two individuals meet as distinct selves. In this new model, empathy no longer drains. It nourishes. Love no longer consumes. It balances. The empath becomes not a mirror for others, but a full presence in their own right. The inner marriage. Jung often used symbolic language, drawn from alchemy and myth, to describe psychological transformation. One of his most powerful metaphors was the Conjunction, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche. For empaths, this inner marriage happens when caring for others and caring for self are united. Neither dominates. Both are honored. Imagine it as two wings of a bird. Too much selflessness, and the bird veers off course, spiraling into exhaustion. Too much selfishness, and the bird becomes isolated, incapable of sustaining flight. But when both wings move together, balance and freedom emerge. This is why reclaiming sacred selfishness is not a betrayal of empathy. It is its completion. Spiritual implications, from savior to soul. Jung warned against what he called the inflation of the healer archetype. When empaths identify too strongly with saving others, they risk losing themselves in a messiah fantasy, believing their worth exists only in healing the world. But individuation requires disidentification from archetypes. Instead of being the healer, the empath learns to relate to the healer energy within. Instead of trying to be a savior, they become a human, complex, flawed, whole. This shift has profound spiritual consequences. Empaths often discover that what they sought in others, a sense of worth, belonging, peace, was always available within. Jung would call this the encounter with the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, larger than ego, larger than persona. It is in this encounter that empathy becomes sacred, not as a duty, not as compulsion, but as the natural radiance of a whole human being. The social dimension. Jung was not only concerned with individuals, but with culture. He believed the neglect of the inner world had collective consequences. A society that devalues empathy breeds cruelty, but a society that demands empathy without boundaries breeds burnout. The empath's journey, then, is not merely personal. It carries cultural significance. To model sacred selfishness is to show that care can be sustainable, that compassion can coexist with strength, that saying no can serve life as much as saying yes. In a world overwhelmed by both apathy and exploitation, such a model is revolutionary. The long road of individuation. Jung reminded us that individuation is not a one-time event, but a lifelong unfolding. For empaths, the return of sacred selfishness is only one chapter. There will always be new shadows to meet, new relationships to renegotiate, new depths of self to uncover. But with each integration, the empath moves closer to what Jung called wholeness, a state where contradictions are not eliminated but embraced, a state where the self is not a mask but a living process. And perhaps most importantly, wholeness is not solitary. It radiates outward. The empath who has reclaimed themselves does not disappear into selfishness. They become a beacon. Their care no longer enslaves them. It frees them and those around them. Closing the circle, we began with Jung's recognition that empaths are not merely kind souls, but complex beings shaped by shadow and sacrifice. We saw how their gift can become their wound, how their sensitivity can both connect and consume. And we explored how reclaiming sacred selfishness transforms not only the empath, but also their relationships, their spirituality, and even the society around them. For Jung, the empath's journey is not about becoming less, but about becoming whole. It is about moving from compulsive care to conscious compassion, from false harmony to authentic love, from shadow to integration. And as he so often reminded us, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For empaths, this is the ultimate act of courage. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, this privilege can feel like a burden at first. To step out of the role of endless giver, to risk disappointing others, to admit, "I matter too." All of this feels like betrayal. But in truth, it is the path home. From survival to freedom. The empath's early life is often built on survival. They learn to sense every shift in the emotional weather, to read people like open books, to anticipate storms before they strike. These skills keep them safe. They prevent conflict. They maintain connection. But survival is not the same as freedom. Survival narrows life into constant vigilance. Freedom opens life into authenticity. The task of the empath is to cross this threshold, to recognize that the very strategies that once saved them now hold them captive. Jung called this process individuation, the transition from living as a mask to living as a self, the courage to set boundaries. At the heart of this transformation lies a deceptively simple act, setting boundaries. For the empath, boundaries are not just practical, they are spiritual. Each no is a reclamation of soul. Each act of self-care is a declaration of existence. Jung believed that neurosis often arises when people ignore the demands of their inner truth. The empath's anxiety, exhaustion, and resentment are not signs of weakness, but signals from the psyche itself. You cannot abandon yourself forever. To set boundaries, then, is not selfishness, it is alignment with life. It is the psyche demanding balance. Compassion without chains. When sacred selfishness is integrated, empathy itself transforms. It is no longer compulsive, draining, or fear-driven. It becomes compassion without chains. You listen without losing yourself. You give without collapsing. You care without controlling. This is empathy as Jung envisioned it. Not martyrdom, but strength. Not erasure, but presence. And it has ripple effects. Relationships deepen when they are based on truth rather than performance. Love flourishes when it is offered freely, not extracted through guilt. Even society benefits when compassion is modeled as sustainable, not self-destructive. Individuation as a collective act. Jung often insisted that individuation was not merely personal, but also collective. Each person who becomes whole contributes to the healing of the larger world. For empaths, this means that reclaiming sacred selfishness is not abandoning their calling, it is fulfilling it. By embodying wholeness, they show others that care and strength can coexist, that love and limits can walk hand in hand. In a culture that exploits sensitivity, this is an act of quiet rebellion. In a time of division, it is a model of integration. The final integration. The journey is not easy. It asks the empath to confront guilt, fear, and the loss of old roles. It asks them to endure the discomfort of disappointing others. It asks them to face the shadow they have long buried, the right to take up space. But beyond the fear lies freedom. Beyond the shadow lies wholeness. Beyond the compulsive giving lies authentic love. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." For the empath, this is the final truth. You are not destined to be drained, overlooked, or used. You are not condemned to live as everyone's caretaker but your own. You are destined for wholeness, for a life where empathy and individuality are not enemies but partners. Closing words. The empath's path, as Jung might describe it, is not about becoming less caring but about becoming more real. It is about weaving together the tenderness of the heart with the firmness of the will. It is about finding the sacred balance where compassion flows freely because it no longer costs your soul. And perhaps that is Jung's deepest gift to empaths, the reminder that your wholeness is not a luxury, but a necessity, that your selfishness is not sin, but sacred, that the most loving thing you can do for the world is to love yourself enough to be whole.